Again, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So nice to have you all join us today. If you don't know me already, my name is Janelle Hazard. I'm the Executive Director and Curator at TEFRA ICA. This is our first full in-person program post-pandemic, which is very exciting. We've had a ton of virtual programs which have been incredibly well attended. We also have a satellite gallery space in Reston Town Center that's dedicated solely to local and regional artists. And that space has an outdoor courtyard. So we have had in-person programming there, but this is our first in the main gallery and it feels really great. It's also my first, I should say, because I joined the GAP institution March 2020. And the same weekend that the stay-at-home orders were put into place. So this is my first in-person program being here, and I'm so happy to be here. So we're here on the occasion of Dominic Chambers' What Makes the Earth Shake, the opening reception artist talk, and I'm so excited to be sitting here with Dominic. We've had such a busy week. Yeah. We started out with a artist talk at American University. It was a conversation between Dominic and professorial lecturer Andrew Wasserman at AU. Dominic did MFA studio visits there, probably 20 or so lots of student engagement, which is incredible. Then we were at Howard University, where Dominic did more MFA studio visits and gave an incredible artist talk. And this is sort of our finale, but it's a finale, but if you know Dominic and you see his work, you know this, he's really just getting going. Things are just heating up. So it's an exciting time to have him here. Before we get started, I want to give a few acknowledgements. First, I want to thank my team, Tanner, Hannah, Sophia, especially Hannah and Sophia. This is Sophia here. There's Tanner there. Raise your hand, team members, if you're around. But Hannah and Sophia worked so hard to install this show on their own, took care of all of their promotional materials and everything. So I really just am very thankful for their great work in making this show look incredible. Bravo. And then I have to thank Reston Community Center, who generously sponsors this program and most of our programs. I also want to thank the other sponsors of TEFRA ICA, Arts Fairfax, Virginia Commission for the Arts, National Endowment of the Arts, and hello and thank you to the board members that are here tonight, Robert Gowdy, Ann Barbieri, Karen Lewis, Scott Pryor. If I missed you, please forgive me, but thank you so much for being here. It means a lot. And I also want to thank the collectors of Dominic's work that are here with us and have also loaned the work to support an exhibition. And also his galleries that are here tonight. Fiona from Lehman Maupin. I'm not sure if Nicola's here from Luce Gallery, but you all have been so incredibly supportive to making this exhibition happen. So thank you. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the original stewards of the areas known today as Reston and Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., which include the Piscataway peoples, the Manahoac peoples, and the surrounding diverse Native communities who make their home here today. All right, now to introduce Dominic and begin the talk. Dominic Chambers was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He lives and works in New Haven, Connecticut. He creates vibrant paintings that simultaneously engage art historical models such as color-filled painting, gestural abstraction, and contemporary concerns around race, identity, leisure, and reflection. He received his BFA from the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, his MFA from Yale, and he is currently a part of group exhibitions that are on view at Paul Tasman Gallery in New York and the Institute of Contemporary Art, Miami. Chambers' work can be found in a number of private and public collections, including the Institute of Contemporary Art, Miami, LACMA, which is the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and Perez Art Museum in Miami. He is represented by Lehman Maupin in New York, as well as Luce Gallery in Italy. And he was recently listed on the Forbes 30 Under 30 listing, identified as one of the most exciting emerging artists of his generation. Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. 30 months. So I think I'm going to do what I did at American, which is to start the talk off with An excerpt from the essay from Zoe Hopkins is an essay that Zoe contributed to the exhibition catalog for this show. And exhibition catalogs are available at the front desk, free for you to take, as well as posters. Please take those with you before you go. Zoe is a student at Harvard University, and she's a writer for Art Forum, Hyperallergic, Brooklyn Rail, Cultured Magazine, and more. And I thought this could be a nice way to begin because it invites an interesting description of Dominic's work. And if you feel inclined, you can close your eyes and listen to this text. It's up to you, or you can look at the artwork, whichever feels most comfortable. Dominic Chambers' paintings are lush but quiet. They are thick with shades of blue, red, purple, and black that coat his scenes in the balm of stillness. The figures within luxuriate in hushed worlds of interiority, which come to us in that undefinable zone between fantasy and life. Black figures are cast in soft light and equally soft shadows, their bodies safely ensconced in the serenity of Chambers' brushwork. The works and what makes the earth shake are a breath, a sigh of relief, for finally, Black life finds reprieve from the brutal state of emergency that so often describes it. And so if you close your eyes, you can open them. But I think Zoe's writing just opens the door for us and welcomes us to sort of step into the work. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Dominic to, I can ask you a question if you want, but you can also just start. Maybe for those who may not be familiar with your work or just encountering your work for the first time, how would you identify yourself as an artist? How do you identify, and can you explain your practice to us?
Yeah, okay, so first, thanks to Janelle for the kind introduction, and thank you to all of you who are here in the room with me tonight. It's great to see all your faces. It's extremely generous. I'm really humbled to see the room filled with so many beautiful spirits and souls in this space. So thank you. I know you guys could be anywhere else on a Saturday night. This is nice. As Janelle said, yes, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I came into my art education at the behest of a girlfriend of mine in high school, actually. You know, growing up, I was always artistically inclined, right? Like I love drawing, I love engrossing myself in literary texts. You know, there was lots of books scattered around my home growing up. You know, I grew up in the northern part of St. Louis, Missouri, which was quite an impoverished part of that city, you know, on the north side. But there were always books and ways to create just like prevalent in my home, right? You can engage with a book that's on the floor. You can, you know, take white pieces of paper out of things that are laying around the house, and you create something, right? Even though your resources were limited. And so I grew up in, you know, what some would consider to be like, you know, a ghetto, so to speak, you know, and when you're encountering something in that environment, you oftentimes normalize it as just ubiquitous. You know, it happens to everyone else around you, you know, like gang violence, poverty, you know, the precariousness of having utilities that are going to, you know, remain consistent, light, water, gas. And the struggles of maintaining those things seem to be quite prevalent amongst most of the people in that population that live in that community. And so as a dreamer, as a thinker, as someone who has an overactive imagination of sorts, you know, I start to look for, you know, a way to kind of make sense out of my experiences, you know, growing up in the northern side of St. Louis. And in doing so, I started to kind of encounter text, you know, and like my relationship to literature and my relationship to text, and in particular, text that had a lot to do with the literary genre called magical realism. How many of you are familiar with that genre in literature? Wow, that's great. That's phenomenal. Cool. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, magical realism is held as a Colombian idea in literature, you know, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's believed to be the godfather of the genre itself. But it's the counterpart of the theoretical and critical framework of surrealism, right? And magical realism was the acceptance of magic or the absurdity within the otherwise rational world. In other words, you know, within one's perceived set of circumstances or within one set of like assumptions around what is possible or acceptable within their frame of reference as as they relate to reality. What is acceptable within that framework? As we all can attest, dealing with the 2020 COVID pandemic, that certainly, I would think, subverted our expectations for what is acceptable or what is possible within the otherwise rational world, right? So in a way, that became a very surreal event for a lot of us. Now, for a lot of people growing up in impoverished neighborhoods, navigating the complicated set of circumstances that are consistent and prevalent in those environments, that is a form of surrealism in and of itself, because it deviates so far from what we assume to be acceptable within our larger frame of society, And so building from this kind of dubious position I found myself in, text that kind of became the foundation and the groundwork for which I started to develop my artistic practice from, were texts like The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, for which the show borrows its title, What Makes the Earth Shake? And so James Baldwin was an essential writer for me, him among others like W.B. Du Bois or Zora Neale Hurston or Octavia Butler. And what all these writers have in common is that they utilize surrealism or the power of metaphor to explain the absurdity of their life circumstances, right? The absurdity of navigating the world occupying the Black body. And so if we were to think about Baldwin's text in The Fire Next Time, the letter to his nephew, which introduces the book, Baldwin goes on to write to his nephew, and he explains that one's relationship to the world, and the ability to acquire one's own self-determination, to establish value and a desire for one's own livelihood, has everything to do with one's sense of reality, right? It struck me that Baldwin, and mind you, I'm framing this all in a particular way because I think it's necessary to unpack these paintings, right? And we'll start connecting this how these paintings start to function soon. But Baldwin started to use, surrealism or a language around the surreal to describe the absurdity of navigating, the Black experience in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? And so the fact that stood out to me so much, one's sense of reality. And so I hung onto that, that phrase so much and just figured out there's something there, there's something really in there that he's trying to get to that other people are perhaps dismissing. Oftentimes, you would be cited as a crazy person to frame things in such a way, to use such language to color your experiences. But it's echoed again in the book, The Souls of Black Folks, or the book, The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Whereas if you guys are familiar with Ralph Ellison's text, it has the idea of dealing with the Black subject as being invisible, right? This idea that this individual has no presence or is not being participated with on equal level or equal ground as another subject. And so within my work, I wanted to figure out how I can combine, this idea of magical realism, surrealism, and circumvent, this narrative around the Black body, that is situated in, as we contextualize in the United States, as being sensationalized, problematic, traumatic, aggressive. And then to start thinking about, what does it mean for the Black body to do nothing, to be situated in a moment of rest, to have a point of sustainability, right? That becomes a surreal gesture, right? For a body that's not the utility that this body is meant to have in this country, right? Black bodies weren't brought here to rest. You were brought here to establish and maintain wealth and power, And so within my images in this space, to bring it back to the paintings, I wanted to think about what lies in that space of stillness that has been prevented or withheld from a certain group of people, right? And as we all know, that when you act aggressively or you act very swiftly to a set of issues or concerns, things oftentimes go astray, right? They oftentimes go wrong because you're acting impulsively, or at the very least, you're acting without a sense of criticality. And so stillness becomes the most productive and most profound tool that you can use as a form of liberation and as a form of just resistance, right? Recognizing the circumstance that you're in that weren't established from you. You had no hand in establishing the system that forces you to work every day, to live, to work, And then thinking about what happens to us when we do allow ourselves to remain still. I'm a bit of a little book nerd, so I'm going to be throwing a lot of different references. So I'm really into Stoic philosophy. And in Stoic philosophy, there's a book called On the Shortness of Life by Lucius Seneca. Are you guys familiar with Seneca's writing? So Lucius Seneca was a Stoic philosopher. I believe he was Roman, if I remember correctly, like many of the Stoics. But in the book on the shortness of life, Lucius Seneca outlines this idea that if you were to add up every single hour of your life, every single minute, every single second, and these are hours of your life that weren't responsible to your family, to your job, to your, your friends, not to a sport or an activity. If you were to add those hours up, then you probably didn't really live. You were exhausting your life, right? And the circumstances of the Black body in this country, as a workforce, as a mode of being a laborer, as being established for our relationship to capitalism and each other, like what that does is that it compromises the soul, your ability to establish and relate to your own life, and to circumvent certain issues that may be prevalent for you. So I make images like these, where these individuals are, removed from the dramatic, they're removed from the sensational. And the supernatural occurrences happen in my use of color, it happens in my use of texture, the kind of subtle obscurity or the subtle absurdity in my use of environmental descriptions. Now, where are these spaces located? And so these are all things I'm trying to parse out in my work, so to speak, but using art history and art historical modes in painting as a means to further that discussion. And so thinking about the history of color field paintings, which being in growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, we have, at the St. Louis Art Museum, we have these large Ellsworth Kelly paintings, and they were just color fields. I remember being a child and having a hard time understanding those particular paintings. And I'm sure we've all had that relation to art. When you go to a museum, you oftentimes feel like, is this art for real? You ask yourself these questions, whether it be explicitly or implicitly, you're thinking this shit. You're like, what legitimizes this as an art object, And I oftentimes know, to be completely honest, I had that relationship to those paintings too, And so it's ironically enough, the first body of work I established and I started to make post-Yale was a body of work I called the Primary Magic Series. When the goal of that body of work, as we can see with the red painting, and we'll probably go through it as well, now become more deliberate, more direct, more specific. But the general overview of that body of work is to see the intersection between color field paintings, privileging the power of primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and seeing how I can use them to describe a whole host of other ideas. So if you're going to tackle the color red, for example, just how well do you know that color? How much magic can you pull out of that color, by limited means? And this is where art history became the tool for me as well, to negotiate these more surreal or kind of literary concerns that I had, and to give them a visual image, right? Something that we can attach these literary concerns to. Was a painting by Giovanni Bellini. When I'm not sure if any of you guys are familiar with classic art history or color theory issues, or maybe you're not. Anyway, y'all don't read color theory for fun? Okay, it's just me. Okay. I'm the nerd. And so Giovanni Bellini has a painting called The Sacred Conversation. And in that particular painting, the sacred conversation is of Mary speaking to a couple of saints. And the saints are, of course, informing her of her pregnancy with Christ, right? And so at first glance, when you see that image, your immediate read would be, oh, it's very didactic, right? The sacred conversation is the conversation between the saint and the biblical figure of Mary. And I would say, the first assumption, you might be right, but a deeper and more rigorous read of that painting is that the sacred conversation is between those colors. The way that artists use color to describe the magical occurrence happening within that scene, that a woman can be impregnated by a deity, and that we have to acknowledge that as just being normal and acceptable and real, right? And so in that moment, I understood that color can be a means to describe a surreal or magical occurrence, right? And so in the Primary Magic series, I tried to tackle that issue. How do you use color to evoke magic or the surreal or the sublime or the otherworldly, while using a pretty mundane or simplified, issue, right? Like laying down and reading a book, laying down and doing nothing at all. Because oftentimes that's the thing you probably are doing the least if you were to really think about how you spent your day. You know what I mean? Like you probably aren't doing that a whole lot. And so those are some of the things I tried to think about. But upon, thinking about the history of magical realism, these literary concerns, borrowed from people like Baldwin, Du Bois, and, to go off on a brief tangent here, the book that I wanted to bring up, The Souls of Black Folks, which we'll be talking about as well as I go through individual images. In the book, The Souls of Black Folks by W.B. Du Bois, as anyone familiar with that text? Lovely. So in the book, The Souls of Black Folks, and obviously to Janelle's credit, because the original title of this exhibition was going to be Of Our Spiritual Strivings, because that's the first chapter in the book. But we went with what Shakespeare, because I think it's better, it's awesome. It makes sense. But anyway, so this idea of the veil. So in the book, The Souls of Black Folks, W.B. Du Bois describes what he calls the veil, that bodies are seen through this veil-like structure. And the veil, for Du Bois, as he articulates it, is this ability or inability to observe someone in the fullness of who they are, the full aestheticness of who they are, right? Independent of preconceived ideas about their racial identity, preconceived about their sexual or geographic identity. And as for Du Bois in particular, as he was writing this, as it pertains to the Black subject, it was also in response like our skin tone, the color line, right? Recognizing that your body is a alert, it's an alarm, so to speak. That when you enter a space, it immediately sets something off in someone else's psyche to participate with you in a certain way, you know? And, you know, I liken it to like, you know, being a Black guy going into a store like Brooks Brothers. You know, you realize like you go into Brooks Brothers, like everything's on sale. I'm like, but I don't know if I want anything, right? That for Du Bois is called double consciousness. This idea that you understand that you're being racially profiled, that racial undertones are coloring your interaction with an individual. You can't prove it, but you know what's happening, right? And you know, for the ladies in the room, you probably experience this more than all of us. You know, when you're at a bar or you're out at a club, you know that this man or woman who's approaching you probably isn't all that interested in getting to know who you are really. Like you're an object for them to participate with, you know, to get to know on their own terms until such things are established otherwise. And so in a way, you're being seen through this veil. And so I try to figure out how would I give the veil an image if it's a social phenomenon? In other words, it's something that you experience but don't see. For me, it will be this raindrop, because when it storms outside and you go outside and you try to like, you know, walk somewhere or, you know, bring your car in and it's storming, it compromises your vision. You know, you're unable to see what's in front of you. Everything else becomes blurred. You know, like everything else, you have to struggle to see what's in front of you in its fullness aesthetic of what it is. And so for me, it originally manifested as these raindrop-like motifs that were going to create literally a veil-like pattern. In later works, as I started to negotiate the veil in a different way, as we'll see as we go around the show. I'm rambling. Am I taking up too much space?
Great.
Okay. I just wanted to say, because they was just sitting off to the side. She's like, okay. She's like, okay, just like, you know, render me in the veil down, make me invisible. It's okay. I'm describing this shit. It's like, oh, there you go. It's like, yeah, I know it's happening to me right now. It's like, this man is so I'm joking, but you know. So again, the thinking about the veil, magical realism, I learned that there's just so many ways to describe this issue, right? And it's something that's going to be a lifelong journey for me. And in doing that, with these, if you even think about just how complicated some of this stuff is that I've laid out before you, it's insane for me to think that we'll have one idiosyncratic method of dealing with it, right? Like I knew that I had to like divide up my practice, so to speak, utilizing art history as a tool in the most effective measure. And so I have a body of work that's also on the show from the primary magic theory called the wash paintings. And the wash paintings, as you'll see as we go through, they look quite differently than the primary magic paintings, which are oftentimes a color-filled dominant image. But the wash paintings for me were meant to have a relationship to not only kind of the avant-garde, modernist abstract painters like, you know, Helen Frankenthaler, Morris Lewis, Rothko, artists of that, of that lineage, of that era. And starting to think about how I can use that history to have a conversation in conjunction with, you know, a conversation with magical realism and surrealism as well. And so, and I'm not making Rothko paintings, right? Like no painting in here is just like two squares nested on top of each other, thinned down with turpentine and oil paint, right? But it's the power of that gesture. For those who are familiar with the history of Rothko's paintings, or even someone like Morris Lewis, or abstract paintings in general, But that when you encounter those colorful paintings, you're meant to be transported into like a transcendental experience because you're overwhelmed by the color relationships that are happening within that image. And so for myself, as I start to shift over into a different body of work called the wash paintings, I started thinking about, well, how is it that one describes an abstraction? How do you describe an abstraction outside of linguistics? If you're dealing with something like the veil or the black body, which in and of itself is a surreal encounter, how does that function in an image, right? And so I started to create these images that were, in my opinion, images that weren't necessarily ubiquitous in the catalog of images we would find of Black people, such as, actually, let me pull back on that, because there's two parts to that. So indeed, you would find catalogs of images of Black bodies participating with each other, being friends and things like that. But that particular mode of image making has its own history. In the 1950s, that's what is called the Black arts movement, in which a lot of Black painters and a lot of Black artists created images of the Black community that was meant to be, was meant to appeal in a lot of ways to the emotional needs of the Black community, to see images of ourselves that are charming, acceptable. And so I don't know if any of y'all watch Good Times. Have y'all seen that show? So in Good Times, at the end of the song, there's an Ernie Barnes painting called The Sugar Shack. And so that particular image can be located in like the Black arts movement, right? So that Black arts movement is meant to be a resistance, right, to the kind of like social narrative that the Blacks at that time were negotiating. In my work, I didn't want to necessarily, make an image that was meant to escape, an antagonist or a problem, but to instead look at social conditions, and like the veil, like one's sense of reality, like one's relationship to an environment, like one's relationship to their own workplace or their own lives, so to speak. So to the wash paintings, making images of Black bodies laughing, hanging out, seeing each other, and then obstructing that image, washing it all away, creating a barrier that prohibits your ability to not only participate with those figures, but to see them as well. So in that moment, you are seeing through a veil. The veil is no longer a raindrop, it's a wash of abstraction that you have now, you got to negotiate your own relationship to. Does this wash of abstraction prohibit your relationship to those bodies? Or is it something that you will, I guess, put off and maintain your engagement with the image to try to figure out whether or not you can see fully what's happening in it? Like what is that environment those subjects are in? Are you willing to do that? And are you willing to do that knowing that those subjects and those paintings are indifferent to you participating with them? So none of the subjects in my paintings acknowledge anyone in this room. They don't even acknowledge me. They're engrossed in their own livelihood. They're laying down on the couch, looking at text, looking out of a window. Are you willing to give that figure your time? Are you willing to stand there with it? Are you going to like figure out your own relation to that kind of experience? And so for me, that was one of the things I tried to figure out how I can make happen. With an image, how can I provoke my viewer in implementing them in that space to draw attention to their veil? Some of the issues is I think with a lot of individuals' relation to art, especially like some artists, is that art oftentimes comes from like this very emotional and like sensitive and spiritual place, which it sometimes does, but art is also an intellectual activity. Like you go to an artwork, you go to museums because you're intrigued by the creative production of an artist, right? Like this history of creative productivity that these artists were participating in and investing years and years of their life into, right? And so for me, when I think about, my relationship to painting, like I'm interested in like disseminating ideas, to a viewer. So if an individual sees that wash painting, hopefully they're interested in like, why is there this glob of dark paint that is over this, painted image of these figures? I want to see the figures, right? Hopefully, it will provoke them to go find out why that is. And if they do, it will lead them to the souls of Black folks. It will lead them to that literary text, right? And hopefully if participating with that text, will bring them back to that particular image, right? And so now I can start to recognize art as a means to disseminate intellectual information, right? Not only in the sense that it has relationships like intellectual tools like books and literature or written essays and texts, but also to like just makers, people who are interested in making things. If you're a painter and you're interested in trying to understand the color red, yellow, which is a really difficult color to paint with because it's so damn transparent. If you want to study how to make that particular yellow work and function well, then you should look at paintings by painters who understand that color. And the only way you can understand that color is by learning about it, reading about it. And so I oftentimes return to this book by Marcia Hall called Color and Meaning. And Color and Meaning, in that book, she describes the 4 primary modes of painting that a lot of our historical painters use from the 14 and 1600s. One that I found myself mostly fond of and that I thought was most effective for describing my images was a painting mode called unione. It's spelled U-N-I-O-N-E, which is, it sounds like union, right? Unity. And it's because you want to create harmony through a color. And so if I was to create a red painting, such as the one in the back room, like Send It On, initially you have to ask yourself, how well do you know this color? And if you want to effectively use this color well, then unione might be the best way to stretch out that color. To instead of using blacks and whites to, see what a color spectrum does, you instead incorporate oranges, yellows, think about that color temperature, not only just its value, its chroma relationship. That's the reason that color glows, when you see that painting, right? And it's just recognizing that I studied a mode of painting that allowed me to describe a painting that can affect the space because colors are now deployed in a more sensible and more comprehensive manner. There's not much chaos in them. They're far more calculating. And that for me was really important just as a practitioner, and to make that information available. Some artists, Janelle and I was talking, we were at Howard and American University. Now, so we ask ourselves, what do you want a viewer to take away from when you engage with an image? What is it like? What do you want me to get from this? And we all ask ourselves that. That's why we get so mad when we see these paintings we don't understand, because we feel like we're not getting anything from them. Kerry James Marshall, who was a leading figurative painter in the Black art historical canon. And I say that because that's what he's looking at. But when he was asked, what does he want a viewer to get from his paintings? He said, I just want them to look at it and see what's there. I just want you to see what's there, and I want you to see how this shit is done well. like that was his answer. It was like he meant it. He was like, no, I don't want you to have some emotional tug. He said, I want you to go and look at my painting and just see how something can be done well, the mastery of a certain form. If you're looking at a Cubist painting, you're not looking at these things, but you don't want to understand them. You want to understand what makes Cubism so enticing, And for Kerry James Marshall, that was exciting, to think about, no, I don't need an emotional tug for it. It's enough that this image exists. And now the execution of it is what I want you to appreciate. For me, I want someone to participate with these images, not only have an intellectual response, but also want you to have a static response, right? I want you to be able to look at these paintings and just don't do anything. Just stop, just stop right there. And in that moment, you're communing with that painting, you know what I mean? And in that instance, no one's asking anything of you. That subject isn't asking anything of you, right? And in that moment, as you allow your mind to wander, your spaces can also transform, And that's why I'm so keen on transforming the environment of the subjects in my painting. How many of them, I've been rambling for a minute. If y'all let me talk, I'm like your grandpa. I will talk you to the ground. There can be sleeping heads like this, and I will still be talking. I'm indifferent of your comfortability. Everyone's good? Y'all alive? We're all good? Really fun. Cool. I think I saw my goodness, y'all, it's so funny. It's crazy, right? You still making the art show?
But since we're going to go around, so we're doing an introduction to the show and to Dominic for the virtual audience. And then maybe we could open up for Q&A shortly and then, explore some other works. But I have 2 questions before we do that.
And please feel free to interject.
So you mentioned the participation with the viewer, but as people may have noticed with this work, the viewer is not acknowledged in the work. The subject is always looking away from the viewer. You're not there. You don't know whether you're supposed to be there and seeing the work. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the intentionality behind not acknowledging the audience?
Yeah, because sometimes you just want a life that's yours. You know what I mean? Like privacy is
You're
important.
contemplating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like privacy is important. Like,
Yeah.
like we live in this era where everything is frontal. You know, you get on social media, I see a lot. I know what a lot of my friends are doing. I'm like, yo, I've seen you. You can't tell me you've been tired. You cannot tell me that. I was like, I wouldn't believe you. I was like, because Instagram tells me differently. You know, it's like, well, I see you at the club. You're having a great time. You know, you have a very vibrant and robust social life.
Yeah.
Right? And that's all well and good. You know, it's all well and good. It's fine, you know, live your life. But if you're, and this is, I'm happy to ask that question because I think I missed out on articulating this and why I feel like these images are necessary. If you are growing up in a society that tells you, and this again, to go back to Baldwin, and I'll just use his words as he wrote them to his nephew, is that when you were born in this country as a Black person, you were born there in a ghetto for no other reason than just because you were Black. Right? Like that's what redlining is. It's no other issue. It's not like you weren't going to make a lot of money. It's not like your family members were criminals. You just so happened to be born in a certain body, and a body that the certain country did not approve of or didn't privilege. Right? And as Baldwin says, like you weren't expected to, you know, to strive for excellence, but you were expected to settle with mediocrity. Right? Like think about that. And it's true for so many kids. Like when you grow up in an environment and you see everyone around you struggling, that becomes your calculus for success. Like why try harder, you know, why move forward? Like the odds are just so against you. As I said earlier in this talk, I didn't want to go to college just because I was artistically inclined. We didn't have any money, right? Like we had no money, no means to guarantee that this would actually work out, right? And to think about the fact that this is the livelihood of so many other children in those spaces. You know, and I'll bring back to why not looking at the view is important. I haven't forgotten that point, y'all. I know I ramble a lot, but I swear it works. And so if you're growing up and not only are you faced with harsh economic realities, you're also thrust and you're kind of hit with a harsh historical reality, right? Where the history that you're told and the history that you're meant to measure yourself up to is one of liberation, one of oppression, one of like, hey man, we just don't want to have to deal with you because people are complaining about your civil rights and we want to give you freedom, right? Just so you don't have to become a problem anymore. You know, and so this is where the history of escape paths come in, right? Where Blacks are going from the South to the North, trying to find someone who won't hate us, who will accept us, who will allow us to live. You know, then we have people like Soda Raw, who's like, shit, this country don't want us. This planet's fucked up. I'm from Saturn. We should all go back to Saturn. You know, and then you have people like Marcus Garvey, you know, who created the United Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. Like these individuals recognize the hardship of those realities, right? And this is why stillness is so important. So if you're like myself, growing up in in the hood, you know, you read the history book, you see your school, you see the lives of your friends, and nothing is helping them escape the traps of that environment. You know, at first impulse, your instinct is, well, I have to hustle, I have to grind, I have to get out of here. I need to join the NBA, I need to go to college, I need to get a full scholarship. These are beautiful incentives to improve your life. But a more effective one is to just kind of slow down and measure your relationship to this reality. You know, just to recognize that you are encountering trauma. You know, like this is what that is, to establish a vocabulary to, better understand your own issues. But without that vocabulary, you're gonna think you're crazy, right? You don't know what these things are, right? And so these individuals don't need to engage with the viewer because they are interested in negotiating, those problems, taking themselves back, not seeking approval, not thinking about their political or economic or social circumstances. This time is theirs, just like your time is yours. And it's important, right, to recognize that. And that's why I was talking about the wash paintings. Are you willing to give that painting your time? Are you willing to sit there with it and participate with it, pick it apart, dissect it, and engage it? And that's not saying that there's an assumption about you having the right answer for a read of a painting. But in that moment, you allow yourself to do something that you oftentimes forbid yourself to do implicitly, right? To remain stationary, to remain curious. Like a lot of people in here, I see a lot of beautiful silver hair. And I like to think that all of you are lifelong learners. Like you guys are inquisitive, you're curious about the world around you, right? And that's something you have to instill inside of a group of people, in order for them to make progress. But you also had a second question. Does it answer the question adequately?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got minutes? That make no sense.
I think I'd love for you to talk about the color of the walls.
Yeah.
It's titled Sea Serpent Gray, but and learning about your work and diving deep into it, I wonder if it has any association with paint blue. And can you answer that? And if it does or does not, maybe explain a little bit about paint blue. And if you can even address these two works behind us, since we're all sort of addressing or placing these works. Great.
Of course, yeah. So one, the color of the wall. So when I first did my institute, I graduated Yale in 2019. 2020, we got hit with the pandemic. And this is why I love my team. And I love people like Janelle, Fiona, Dahlia, Daryl in the crowd, or Shane, because these individuals support me. You know, they believe in what my vision is and what my interests are. So I say all that to say, I had a solo show in 2020 at the August Wilson Center of African American Cultural Center. And like all these individuals I just mentioned, one of the chief curators, her name is Kilolo Luckett. She helped, facilitate the show, gave me the space. And mind you, we didn't know, none of us knew COVID was happening, right? No one's had a fucking clue that we were going to be in for a global pandemic. So in organizing for the show, we had time now, like, the whole world was shutting down and whatnot. Kilolo and I had a lot of time to just talk about ideas. And so thinking about installing an exhibition, she was like, what about the color of the walls? Think about the environment in which you want these bright ass paintings to live on. And so the color she came up and she introduced to me was a color called Black Magic. And she had this idea because a lot of the paintings in the show was called the Primary Magic series, or the dominant body of work that was presented. And so I wanted to keep in that tradition because I love the representation of like a really bright painting of mine against a stark black background. So Sea Serpent, it's called Sea Serpent Blue. Or
Sea Serpent Gray.
Sea Serpent Gray. When we started, Janelle and I started thinking about the composition for this show, I was thinking again about what does it mean to like think about this color like Black Magic or the color of the wall, because when I think about color and language, those things are really important for me. Like to see a painting hanging up on a wall of vibrant red and yellow painting hanging up on a wall and realize the color of that wall is Black Magic and the painting is part of a series called Primary Magic. Like there's a relationship there that I think is fascinating, is worth teasing out. So Sea Serpent Gray was a color that I liked more than Black Magic. And I was like, okay, it is not Black Magic, but I think it's more effective, because it has a cool bluish tint to it, right? And I just like that bluish tint. Now, I had never seen this color in person. We oftentimes see it on like, a swatch. So you don't know how it functions in relation to these paintings, but I was pleasantly surprised. Now, does it have a relationship to the color Haint Blue? Are you guys familiar with that color at all? Have you heard of it? No. So Haint Blue is a color that it's a Black cultural color, right? So Haint Blue is often used by Southern Blacks as a means for spiritual protection. And so Haint Blue, if you were to make the color, it's blue, clear, and I think gray or white. It's one of those two to make that color. But think about blue, clear, and then like gray. And so,
is it here in the trim of the shoe?
Not in this particular shoe. It's a lot paler.
Okay.
It's much paler. But it is important to think about how color has a certain function amongst people as well. And certain colors does have a spiritual component to them. So Haint Blue was used by Southern Blacks as a means to ward off spirits, especially the Creoles, like who thought like spirits were navigating around, their community. They would take this color and they would paint their roofs with it. And the idea and the belief is that when spirits went through the community and they saw those shacks, it was mistake that color for the sky. And so instead of entering, the spirits would then move up, And so I started thinking about the fact that the color blue, and in particular Haint Blue, like has a spiritual and like ancestral relationship to Black people as a means of protection, right? And blue, in particular for Black people, I don't know why we are so attached to it, but we're just like, we love that color, Like we have, an entire musical genre called the blues, right? Like when Blacks in the South were singing, they weren't singing the happy, so they were going through it. You know what I mean? Like they were singing the blues, they were feeling blue, right? But so this idea of color to describe an emotion, right? And this emotion can be found as ubiquitous around the entire community of people who empathize with it and say, no, like the blues, like I am feeling it, man, play the blues for me. My mother was born in '56. And that's what I grew up hearing in the house. Or thinking about jazz musicians like Miles Davis and his album, The Color Blue. And so this idea of like the Black body and its relation to the color blue, which is something I just wanted to tease out a lot of my work. And so none of these paintings in here have that particular color evident in them. We weren't able to acquire for the show, unfortunately. But there are paintings of mine that do tackle that color in particular in their work. Yeah, but if we want to talk about particular paintings here, are y'all interested in some of these paintings over here? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So
Maybe you can start off by saying why you chose these two works to be the promotional works for the show.
yeah, I love these paintings. I mean, I wish I had a deep answer. It's not that I just love it. I just love these paintings. It's not that deep. I just think they're fucking great. I love these two particular paintings in particular, but I love them for my own reasons. And so this one here, and so I also want to talk about my titles, and we can talk now. I'm going to talk a lot. Damn. So a lot of the titles of mine oftentimes have either a cultural relationship to things, or it has a relationship to the subject in the paintings, or it has a relationship to like literature. In this particular painting, this one's called Dark Skin of a Summer Shade, which is borrowed from a Frank Ocean song. I don't know if you guys listen to Frank Ocean, but in the wake of a hurricane, dark skin of a summer shade, right? I love that idea, like in poetry, you know, dark skin of a summer shade, to see a Black body described in that way. Like, that's beautiful to me. And this particular subject, also all the subjects in my paintings, besides myself, they're all friends of mine. And this guy here is a friend of mine from the Yale School of Drama named Chris Betts. And he does have dark skin of a summer shade. I see Chris, I'm like, man, that man is so beautiful. Like, his color is a dark skin of a summer shade if I've ever seen one. Think about that, think about this man here. And so this one's great, but it was, again, thinking about this idea of the veil and the environment around it, this kind of like atmospheric cloud that becomes black, is a product of the golden book that the subject is engaging with. And again, in all the images in my painting, you'll notice there's no text inside of my books. Like, there's no literary text, there's no fucking cover. These things are non-existent because they're not, that's not the point, right? Art historically speaking, whenever we engage with, you know, a subject and, you know, they're holding a tool like a book, an intellectual tool like a book, the subject or the material of the book is not necessarily the point of the image. The image is what that book represents to that subject and for us. We understand that when we see a painting of the Medici family and these individuals like Cosimo de' Medici have a book in there, that book for him represents power. It represents intellectual capabilities. It represents his class, that he was a learned man, that he was able to afford education, right? You don't know what this man was reading. He could be reading like Dr. Seuss or some shit. Like, you know, that's not the point, right? The point is that he was able to participate with that thing. Now, Black bodies are, historically speaking, we were status symbols. You put us in paintings because we were a means to show your wealth, right? That's what we were. The fact that you had a Black body with you and you were a white family, that means you have money. You could afford to have that Black. Like, that's like, oh, look how Black he's here, you know, but we have a golden necklace on as well. Like painters were very deliberate in showing social hierarchies within images. And so I wanted to make sure that the subjects of my paintings were also participating with these sacred tools, these sacred objects, right? That were once denied of them. And they're always in their hands. Like, none of these books are on the table. They're not posturing with them. These books are kept close to home, right? And I like that relation to the book and that body. You know, oftentimes, so if you saw like, there was a show up at the Met of the Medici family's collection from Florence. All of these individuals in those paintings, if you saw those paintings, like, they have the book on the table, they're flexing with it, right? They're not like looking at these things. They're not like over like, oh my God, I'm like reading this book and it's so brilliant, it's so great, I'm so smart. No, you have it with you, you study. It's meant to act as a form of jewelry almost, right? It becomes an artifact, right? And like, that for me was fascinating. Like, just the fact that certain tools can be reduced to that, you know? So dark skin of a summer shade. And then this was called Born at Night. And that's because the subject in the painting, whose name is Africanus Okokan, a Ghanaian artist, his name literally means born at night. And so that's how the subject has the title. But you notice the raindrop pattern that I was describing, this veil, this curtain, literally now has a body, right? It's now a curtain, right? It no longer has the metaphorical components of the veil that I'm thinking about when I think about W.B. Du Bois. It literally now has the body of that thing. It is now becoming that form. And when I was at Yale, that's often how I use that motif, because I started thinking about the veil, not just as, you know, my body, my skin tone, my culture, but also as a form of performativity, right? Like, the veil is also a barrier which can have protection. It can be the clothing, right? Like, the idea of the way you dress, the way you present oneself. Some individuals see protection inside of the veil. who recognize that once you step outside of it, the space is unsafe. You don't know how to acclimate. You can't participate with it. Right? It's much easier to be veiled, which brings me about the conversation with Andrew, right? Like one's desire to maintain anonymity as a means to preserve themselves, right? Instead of being transparent, opacity is what keeps you safe. The less people know about you, the less access they have to you, the better for a lot of things. Especially in the north side of St. Louis, where everybody's got a bag. And so they don't want to be outside of their bill. They want to make sure that shit is policed as much as possible. Right. And so Africanus Okokan, or not looking outside of the veil curtain, and you'll notice that what he's looking through, can anyone describe what that is? It's a rainbow. And so the veil, like curtain, seeing through it, the rainbow appears. And that's because in art historical paintings, again, think about how color has been used art historically to describe an event or a form or a thing, is that when you saw a rainbow in a painting, you guys can take this with you when you go to the Prado, or you take this to Met, you can shine on all your friends, and you know it's a fact. That a rainbow was meant to alert you as a viewer that something supernatural was occurring. So if you look at maybe a Rembrandt, you maybe look at a landscape, there might be a hints of rainbows there amongst the many brilliant things that this man paints. But it's meant to understand that space is not a regular space, right? It's actually quite baroque. It's irregular, there's something otherworldly occurring there. And it may not be otherworldly in the sense that we imagine spirits and ghosts, or maybe some Bosch shit, like the Garden of Earthly Delights, in which you see a whole lot of fantastical things occurring in one image. But it's the fact that we have, for Rembrandt and a lot of others, it was the acclaim or the adornment of that person, right? To see them present in such a space. They understood that color can function that way. And so for my subject here, looking out into that rainbow, that is a supernatural occurrence. To look out and to imagine a world of different possibilities, to recognize that the space, not this one, but the space that he's looking out or looking into, which is another dimension outside of the painting that we don't have access to, is rife with opportunity. Is rife with possibilities. That is the surreal occurrence for that subject, right? So that becomes like a doubling. You have our space, you have the painting space, and then you have the space literally within it that he's looking through. And those are things for me I try to maintain evident in my work. So if we're going to talk about the self-portraits of myself that are here, of myself sitting in my window. So these self-portraits I all did in 2020, except the most recent one, which is over there. So in 2020 and 2021, I lost both my brothers. So both my brothers passed away. I lost both of them. And I decided to start thinking about what was I doing during the pandemic. I wasn't leaving my house a lot. I was working a lot. And I tried to chronicle or represent the things I did the most. And so I had a show in Italy at Luce Gallery that had one of the window paintings in it. And the series started from two spaces. It was one of the things I did the most during pandemic. So the body of work originally was the three things I did the most during the pandemic. One was looking out the window, one was reading. So there was a painting of me reading, and another was mourning. And so those were the series. But I was fascinated with the window ones in particular, because where I grew up and what I heard oftentimes, especially on a holiday like the 4th of July or on New Year's, or even just on fucking Tuesday, stay away from the window because stray bullets go to the fucking window. That shit can happen. And so my sister, and also, we're Black, we be nosy sometimes. And so my sister and whatnot, with you saw the cops lining the street, which we saw a lot of. You'll see people peek through the window just to see what's happening down the street. Y'all don't do that? Y'all don't be nosy? Y'all not worried about your neighbor's problems? But we would do that a lot, right? But we also recognize that being in proximity to something as fragile as glass, to look outside that space in an environment where people are not concerned about your livelihood, and that's indicative of a lot of other social issues. That's compromising to a person. That's compromising to a child. To know that you can't look outside that window because you could get hit, you could get shot, and it's not an exaggeration, right? That's a surreal occurrence, right? The fact that you can raise a child with that relationship to an object in your home, right? And you understand there are very real consequences to that. Some of you may have raised your children. You're not raising them to be afraid of being near the window on a given day, but I have seen bullets go through windows, right? Oh, that's really unfortunate. No one died, but I see now my sister's point, right? That these things just happen. Stray bullets, they're unfortunate things. And so for my paintings, I wanted to think about just what is outside of that. if what's waiting for you on the other side of problems, right? There's just got to be more out there. Like, you don't want to fucking worry about the fact that you can walk past your neighbor's house and see just 3 bullet holes through it, you know? And so for me, like, the spaces are they're not descript. There's nothing evident there, right? In this particular one, it's opaque, it's washed over with these brushes of cream white that obscures the green lush landscape out there. So there is still a barrier, right? But there is a luminosity to it. If you notice, that entire painting is almost engulfed in darks outside of the light produced by that window, right? So then we can have conversation about this idea of escapism. Is it a physical escape? Is it a cerebral escape? You know, is it an emotional escape, right? Is the subject imagining more for themselves? What do we desire when we look outside of our homes, right? When you look outside of where you are, where you live, do you identify with your environment? Do you imagine more for yourself? Is this adequate for where you want to be in life? Simple gestures like that for me were really important. You know, art historically speaking, you have artists like J.S. Selman who oftentimes painted the stars, right? Just to understand what that represents for a person, to imagine more beyond the cosmos. Have you guys seen any of V.S. Selman's work? She's an extraordinary artist, like, and one of my favorite painters. And I encourage all of you after this talk to just look at some of her star paintings. Like, you understand this woman was in growth, that she would commune with those stars, you know? That her imagination was livened by the idea of another possibility beyond this planet, you know? And so those are some of the concerns I was thinking about in that particular painting, and then think about color relationships too, like warm and cool colors in that particular painting. So if you notice, it goes blue, warm, then green again. Yeah.
We're going to continue to dive into the other works that are in the show. We have about 30 minutes left.
Man, we can talk to y'all. Tell me to shut up.
But I think this may be a good point to open up for questions, whether it's in person or through the virtual audience. And then for those that are in person, we can continue to briefly walk around the show and hear a little bit more from Dominic.
I have one question. Obviously, you bring a lot of who you are and your intellectual ability, your education into your work. You set out initially with the idea that this is developed as you work along, and also how that translates into your technique. I see a lot of like washes, a lot of texture. I mean, interesting stuff going on there. Is it, you say, I'm going to create this piece with this person looking at a rainbow, or does it come as you work at the piece?
You know what's funny? I often have to think about color relationships before I think about an idea. Like, when I made this board and night painting, I wasn't even positive that was gonna, like, Africanus was gonna be my subject.
Right.
I was like, man, it would be so cool, you know, to see a painting that's like really dark and then you like see a rainbow, you know, to be effective. I just thought that'd be an interesting painting issue, you know, because those are things that might color my, you know, my approach, just making the image, because I know what my concerns are. Now, then I just started thinking about how would I want this image to function. You know, like these two particular paintings negotiate similar issues, but they're articulated in quite different ways, right?
Yeah.
And that for me is really important. I do want them to be excited as images. You know, I have a general idea of like what I'm concerned with, and then my concerns and my responsibilities first and foremost would then be to like, how do you make a great painting? You know, how do you make this thing function on the painting?
How do you do it well?
How do you do it well? Yeah, because if I have these ideas, especially as complicated and as theoretical as some of them are, right? Like, you're not gonna be interested to even pick up a book like Souls of Black Folks or, you know, read Ralph Ellison if the painting isn't enticing enough for you. And so I just want to make sure the image in and of itself is strong enough to hold one's attention, to provoke that question.
And your use of techniques, your use of washes and all that, and the way you paint, which is completely different than what I'm painting, which is great. That all falls into it. That comes along as you do.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, for example, the wash paintings I started thinking about because I was obsessed with Morris Lewis.
Okay.
You know, and what's great about Morris Lewis paintings, have you ever seen these things? Like, I am a huge fan of his work, but no one knows how they're made. Like legit, you can look at any book. No one knows how he makes those paintings. If you've seen the Morris Lewis paintings, they're huge, huge veils. And that's what we could actually call veil paintings. Like Micah has one, which is fucking extraordinary, this painting. And when you see these paintings, they're nothing, they'll never last like more than 100 years because they're thin down oil paints with turpentine on raw canvas. And the reason for Morris Lewis doing that is because the canvas would absorb the oil, right? It would absorb it and it's thinned down enough that the turpentine will allow the pigment to just rest on the surface. So he creates this space of depth in an image over just repeated layers, right? And I was like, that is a beautiful way to think about the color of like abstraction and mark making, right? To understand, you don't need to make something opaque. You can create a veil, but just thinning down the hell out of your mediums and just building something up through thin layers of paint, even if you're not concerned about the archival nature of that painting. Because 100 years, that thing won't look like that. It'll start dissolving,
It's gone.
falling apart. It's not archival, but it's effective. And I like the effectiveness of that painting.
Yeah, your memory of gray there, it's got that very, is that like a gray wash?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is my favorite painting.
Oh, thank you. It's the most recent painting in the show.
Yeah, knocked me out when I walked in.
Yeah.
That's a very thin wash too.
Yeah, it's thin. And what's great about the memory of gray painting, some of the early ones, like the more recent ones, like that portrait there, is
On the wall over here,
yeah, they're done on an oil ground.
Which means.
Yeah, and so these two are not on oil grounds. So these are just canvas on gesso on canvas, which we all know gesso is just like a primer to like, you know, preserve the image. What an oil ground does, an oil ground allows that paint, it creates this kind of, I wonder how I could describe this texture and ground that it gives. It feels like a fresco. It feels very marble.
It's very translucent.
Yeah, yeah, you can see
the
it.
texture.
Yeah, so when you apply paint to it, not only is that paint absorbing light, but because of that oil ground, it's shooting back out. And so I don't have to apply it as thickly anymore to describe a certain form, because the planing is now responding to its medium. It's responding to its substrate.
So is that canvas covered with oil then, or what is that?
So an oil ground, you would develop it, you first gesso them completely, seal everything on the weave. And then you have to apply it in 2 to 3 thin coats. So you get like this, like it's almost in a jar, a really strong, high pigmented, I guess a high pigmented paste. Thin it down with turpentine, and then you'd apply that. Wait for it to dry, and you can legitimately see your surface change.
Sure.
It is one of the most rewarding things ever to go into your studio and just like touch that surface. It's so nice. Yeah, it's like, it's really gratifying.
Translucence and those graces, that's lovely. That's really
Yeah.
nice.
So, and that's when you know, as a practitioner, you don't have to overwork something to get the desired result. It might just be a question of your material. Like, and that's one of the things I was expressing to one of the students I did a studio visit with at Howard. Like, he was interested in drawing. And I'm like, oh, well, your drawing, it's not that you're not a great draftsman, you can draw, you just are using limited pencils. Like, you're not thinking about the grades of pencils there are. Like, you can get an HB, you can get a B, you can get a 6B. And those tools are meant to help you get to the goal swiftly, you know, as opposed to burdening the image with like your own skills or lack thereof. Like, yeah, for sure. Yeah, go ahead, bro.
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing?
I'm good, man. We did a show a couple years ago, 2020, and you talked about the influence of Joseph Albers. Can you give us some insight on that?
Yeah, the Joseph Albers. If I bring it up, man, Janelle's mad at me about it.
What?
She's not.
We talked about originally having.
Yeah,
Joseph
having those
Albers
Joseph Albers
in the
stages
show.
in the show.
Yeah.
So again, earlier in the talk, you guys may remember I said I divided up my practice into a number of things, right? The primary magic series, the wash. But at the August Wilson Center, I had a series of paintings that I started during the pandemic called After Albers. And they were a series of paintings I made in response to the painter Joseph Albers. Are you guys familiar with his work? So Joseph Albers, he's really, you know, like famous for his color theory, his book, his writing around color theory, and in particular, the Interactions of Color, which is the book you can get. But Joseph Albers understood is that colors are relational. So if I was to ask someone in this crowd right now, like, is yellow a warm color or a cool color? The answer would always be, it depends. It depends on what it's relational to, right? So for Joseph Albers, you understand, if you put yellow next like a silver or a gray, that yellow might look more green, right? Because the silver and the grays are probably more cool, right? So it brings out something else out of that color. And so the idea being is that when you orient two colors next to one another, they influence each other, right? They vibrate. So one can change, one can become more subdued, or they can jointly create a new color entirely, right? And it's so strange because I didn't really like think about it that much at Yale, you know, despite him being thrown down my throat. But we were like practicing this shit like when I was like 18. I really didn't give it much thought. But thinking about Joseph Albers, I started thinking about, you know, this idea of color theory and how we, in a lot of ways, are like those colors, right? Like you have your body and the context in which you find it, and that dictates how you relate to that particular body. For example, I'm a Black body located in the United States of America, right? That in itself allows my body to be read in a certain type of way, right? My body will not be read the same type of way if I went to Africa itself. I can go back to, I can go to Nigeria, and they would have a very different relationship to my body. I can go to Ghana, I can go to South Africa. You know, one of my close friends who's actually in a painting on the wall there's a blue painting when we enter, he's light-skinned, and so he's like a really fair-skinned Black man. That same subject, if he was to go to South Africa, they would just call him white, despite the fact that here in the States, he's Black, right? Because he has Black parents. You know, we have the one drop rule, but they operate very differently because they have different racial logics, right? They have different racial paradigms. They don't operate the same way we do here. And so again, your body, the context which you find it influences the read of the body. So we're like those, like you're always changing, you're relational, you know? So you're like a Joseph Alvarez painting, you know what I mean? Like your identity can even change, you know, how someone says your name, you know, the certain dialects you encounter, you know, these things call into question your own relationship, your body, your identity, you know, your form, so to speak. And that is where the Joseph Alvarez series came from. And so I started taking a lot of my friends at Yale who were students who were diasporically speaking Black. And so some of them were from the DR, some of them were Honduran, some of them were from Ghana, some from the Cameroon, some of them were Nigerian, and recognized that these individuals who found themselves here in the United States had a very different relationship to American culture, had a different relationship to like American Blacks. You know, it's the most bewildering thing when you hear like another Black person say they don't understand race. And then you realize like, oh, like you're not from America. Like you're like this like a thing, like it's like there's not a thing that you're like dealing with. You're like, yeah, like I don't understand why this person feels this way. And to hear that, you're a little bewildered. And you realize like, no, they just don't have that lens. Like it's something they have to learn because American politics are very specific, you know? So you can't blame them for that curveball, but yeah.
To see if we have any questions in the virtual audience.
Not have any questions as of yet.
All right, why don't we'll take the last question from Daryl and then we can start looking at other works.
First, I'd like to say artist talks are often very obtuse, really smart. You know, she's really smart too, but talk, you know, if she said one word, you were able to just talk. And almost like it's like a speech. It's not that's complimentary.
Yeah,
You know, because obviously that intellect goes into paintings. But I'm wondering, you know, the average person looks at a painting for 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And so this goal about having them pursue other deeper thoughts about going and investing in history of books, not just your responsibility to complete that, but how confident are you that that art, even if all art can affect some of these changes?
Mhm.
I mean, I feel that sometimes the attention span is so lacking, and so, you know, people aren't really engaged.
And you come with the reading.
Yeah, maybe. You know, like that, but that's kind of cool though. That's why I love talking. It's like something like I love people. You know, I love talking about ideas with people, right? And you know, Daryl's completely right. Like most people, like myself, you know, to throw myself under the bus, like sometimes I'm a terrible viewer at art. You know, you take me to a museum, and if I'm tired, I'm like grumpy, I'm like I'm hungry, I'm ready to go. I'm like, okay, like I see this painting, I'm like, okay, I'm like not giving it the full attention it desires, right? So then people just have those days. So he's completely right. Like the attention span is short. A lot of shit impedes your relationship to wanting to spend time with an object. All of this is very true. For myself, I don't expect that my paintings are gonna like immediately or directly affect someone. But what I hope happens is that it's something that's worth returning to, right? Like that's what I tend to look at. Like the most paintings that are exciting for me, I probably like name them on like both my hands, right? The paintings I look at religiously. I come to them all the time. There's certain paintings I go to the museum, and I'm like beelining for those particular paintings, right? My hope is that for certain people, it's like, not everyone's gonna connect with these particular things, right? They're not for everyone else. And that's okay. But what's great about those particular paintings that hopefully they haunt you, even if it's briefly. And if they haunt you enough, if you're encountering them, maybe you see 3 dime chambers in a room, that 4 seconds becomes like 12. You know, and then 12 seconds you spent just doing nothing, you stood there and you participate with something. And maybe like subconsciously on some like Mr. Miyagi shit, you might like that, you know, like that idea that, oh man, like, when did I stand still? It's like, oh, that's right, when I was at this museum. Like this is probably the most static I have been all day, you know? That's a fun thing to think about, you know? Like we were talking about that Jen Packer painting in Mocha. So Jen Packer has this painting called Idle Hands, and I was talking to Andrew Weisserman about it during my conversation with him at AU. And I remember looking at that painting for like, I returned to it maybe 6 times because I was just so bewildered that it existed. Like a painting of that caliber, it's an outstanding painting. And mind you, did I stand in front of it for like 30 minutes? No. When I first saw it, I was like, there's no fucking way this painting is real. I was shook, because she's a master class painter, a different level painter, And there's not many times that you can encounter a painting like that stops you. Like that's like a spiritual thing, like a painter, where you see another practitioner making something like that. It hits different. But that painting for me, I was like, no, you got to go back to paint. I returned to it 6 times, and in total, I probably spent maybe 5 minutes with it. But that's 5 minutes that I will never forget. And so when he brought that painting up, sparked my memory instantly, instantly. And I have a bond with that image. Like if I'm in LA, I'm not trying to move all around that city because I hate traffic. But I will go to Mocha just to spend time with that Jim Packer painting, especially knowing that it's there now. So I'm like, oh shit, this painting's amazing. And mind you, I'm not looking at Jim Packer because I'm like looking to catch up with myself. I'm looking at it, I appreciate it as a painting. Like just a sheer value of seeing another person who's invested in what I'm invested in execute something in such a way. Like that is what keeps me coming back. I don't know what the other people, the thing that keeps you coming back to my work, it might be something different entirely. Hopefully it's leisure, to just go visit a museum, just see one of Dom's paintings, and that's enough.
I'm gonna say one more thing, because you talked about what's gonna happen to your paintings in the future. And I have to say, I was so excited yesterday at Howard in the talk where you gave like you sneakily snuck in the fact, you started off as in drawing. That's what you applied to Yale with. You're now in painting. You talked about cheating on drawing with painting. And then yesterday at Yale, he says, and I'm working on some sculpture now. And I feel like, is there anything you want to share with us? Not too much.
She was like, you want to bring it out?
I'm just gonna throw it out there, and if you want to run with it.
We can talk about it. It's okay. I knew it was I know they took it. Yeah, none of this. She was like, what you pulling out? So yeah, I'm working on some sculpture right now. It's kind of an arduous task, because of the idea that I have that's really specific. And so, my team and I were in the process of trying to create or construct an invisible playground. Right. And not only an invisible playground, but an indivisible playground that you can interact with. So growing up, there was a time when my family and I, we had to sleep in parks. So we slept in parks for a little over a year, between these shelters in downtown St. Louis and these parks that were, we had to wait there and hope that maybe a mattress became available. And so when it didn't, I didn't mind because that meant that I get to play in the park, right? Like we didn't have a fucking alarm. Like my mother slept on the benches and myself and my adopted siblings would play on these playgrounds there. So on the bench that we slept on, there was this playground. And because I spent so much time on that playground, I started at night. And I remember thinking that the playground itself, so the playground itself, it looked like a castle because I saw the silhouette of it. So the peak where you would go down the slide became like the peak. I had a bridge, it had different components. And that really struck with me because playing on that playground as a child like that made my circle, it made me oblivious to the fact that I was actually sleeping in parks. But if you were talking to like your teacher, like, dude, I'm happy that you're having fun on this playground, but you do know you're sleeping in a park, right? So a child, I didn't give a shit. I could stay up late, I can hang out with my mom, I'm playing all the damn time, right? And so I went back and I visited St. Louis, that playground's gone. Like that lot, like this thing that gave me so much joy during a turbulent time in my life, it's like just gone. Like there's just like a fucking abandoned lot there. And so I originally just wanted to make like the ghost of that thing. So I wanted to make, and I wanted to call it like a kingdom, right? Because that's what it was for me. And so the goal was to construct, and that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to figure the logistics and the engineering of this thing out, is to construct a 20-foot by 20-foot playground constructed entirely out of glass. And so the glass will be strong enough that it can hold up to 2,500 pounds, and children can play on it. Because when children interact with their playground and they're walking across these bridges or they're going down a slide, at first glance, it will look like they're moving on the air, right? It will look like they're walking on like just clouds, And so it's this idea that, a playground is a kingdom for the imagination. It's a space where those children go and the imagination is rampant. They're not interested in rational laws, rules, their parents are like, no, like I am a captain of a sea ship right now. And you have to catch me. And I love that, like to be engrossed in play. right? Like that's a social dynamic. It's a form of freedom. It's a space of liberation, and for me, it was a place of escape, and it actually probably helped my sanity, to make that space available. And so, yeah, my team and I were trying to figure out like, how can we make a transparent playground that's interactable, which isn't like that's not even the hard part about it. There's plenty of buildings with like transparent windows they can like hit on and you won't fall through, you can look through them, it's fine. It's the elements, so if you're gonna make something outside, it's great, but a glass structure in the snow in the winter in Missouri is not necessarily the most conducive thing you want to have outside. So we're trying to figure that out, but that's where I'm going next with the work. But again, thinking about this idea of magical realism, like that is magical realism, and just thinking about it in different modes. I think about it in leisure, I think about it in relation to literary texts and Black experiences or lack thereof. And then thinking about it for children, like Black kids who, participate with different spaces, like a basketball court, a library, which is where I spend time too, classrooms, a playground, they're transportative vehicles, for you. That's what they are. And so, yeah, if I can get the sculpture, the engineering of it all figured out, that's what hopefully we'll see in the next year or so.
Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say that I'm inspired by you, and
Oh, you're sweet.
I'm
I'm inspired by y'all. Y'all are nice to me.
congratulations on all of your success. I think we can give Dominic